She had learned to measure the length of a step by the distance between scorn and safety. Years of being reducing glances to a map of exits had carved a caution into the angle of her shoulders and the tilt of her chin. She had been taught, over and over, that there was a fit and proper place for a woman like her. At the edge of rooms, in the quiet of kitchens, and never on the dais where decisions were made. That teaching had the weight of law in her valley, where strength was muscle and blood, where omegas were less than mistakes, wolfless were accidents, and barrenness was a stain written into lineage for generations to come. She moved through that world wearing the trademark of the outcast. Plain skirts patched with the same thread as her dignity, hands rough from work that left calluses but not respect. They called her Lyra of the Hollow, as if the hollow were both home and explanation. The name fit like a stone in a shoe. She could feel it, always, the way neighbors rolled their eyes a fraction too long when she passed, the way children were lifted and hurried away as if her shadow might transfer shame. Her family had been a small thing to begin with, a house on slope that had produced one son who married into status and one daughter whose womb betrayed her. A scandal, a whispered accusation, and the longer story of loyalty and silence that left Lyra alone to manage the hearth and the indignity. She was an Omega, the official said. She had failed at the most basic devotion to their blood and soil. She had no cubs to show as evidence of worth. Worse, she could not shift. For a shifter, that was a final disqualification. In the valley where power was measured by the ease of transformation, being wolfless meant you were untethered from the world that mattered, untethered from the moon's chorus and the pack's heartbeat. People whispered that perhaps the spirit had left her before it reached adulthood. Others said she had been cursed by some jealous witch. No one offered comfort. Only doors closed with the soft, terrible finality of a life being boxed. Inside her chest, though, there lived a different sort of power, a soft, unremarked ability to listen and to mend. Where others healed with salves and muscle, Lyra healed with words and care. She had a patient touch when fever took a child's breath, a knack for knitting broken relationships back into the familial cloth with stories that soothed and rearranged guilt into meaning. When a neighbor's husband returned from the wolflands with fever and nightmares, she sat through the long nights and told of moons that had loved differently, of wolves that had learned to sing with scars. They slept when she lifted the stories, and whether it was magic or simply the easing of worry, they woke repaired. None of that mattered when the valley's traders arrived with a message that made heads turn and teeth bite the bottom of speech. Word traveled fastest when it carried a price, and the price that came to the hollow was not mercantile. It was a proclamation from the highland, from the iron-walled keep, where the Alpha King ruled a territory that extended like a dark thumb across the land. He had demanded a tribute, for one night, for one servant, for the favor of his court. The council had sent 3 names first, as tradition dictated, daughters of minor families, women with dowries. The king had rejected them with disdain. He wanted something different this season, he said, something broken to remind the nobles why they obeyed. The final decision was cruelly efficient. They brought Lyra forward. Lyra had been brought before the council, a procession of lowered heads and faces that could not meet hers. The counselor who made the decree was a gaunt man whose family's lineage was braided into law. He spoke with the cadence of conviction, a litany of reasons that made no sound to her but the shuttering of doors. She understood the ritual. The naming was a sentence, the handing over a confirmation. She had been chosen because she cost them nothing. She had been marked because she was expendable. The cart to the keep was a shaking thing that rolled beneath the wheels of fate. The road up the valley narrowed and then opened, and the keep rose like a promise and a threat above it. Lyra watched the stone walls approach, the crenellations and banners that snapped like the mouths of wolves. She climbed the last steps with hands that remembered the height of hearths rather than the grandeur of courts. Cold air hit her face. The world that lived within those walls smelled of iron, of polished leather, of the kind of fear that wore a crown. He was already there when they led her into the great hall, a silhouette at the center like the last star seen through storm. The men who had accompanied her melted to the edges of the dais, their jaws working with the adjustment of rank and fear. He sat on a throne carved of black wood and bone, a thing of angles that had haunted lullabies until children learned not to dream. Rumor had only grazed his edges. Alpha King Orin, the man who had seared a swath of territory and then kept it with a silence heavier than his sword. He was said to have the temper of winter storms and the vigilance of a mountain. His law was absolute, his scowl law. Lyra found that she could not lower her eyes by training. It would have felt like yielding twice. She met his gaze, and for a moment the hall stilled. He was not what the rumors had made him. Those more monstrous shapes lived in the imaginations of distant tavern talk. But he was a living instrument of control, shoulders like breakers, jaw like a cliff, hair the color of iron filings. His eyes, however, were not the cold coal she had expected. They were a steely gray that held the memory of storms. They slid over her with an impression of appraisal that made her stomach flip in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with being seen. "This is Lyra," the counselor intoned, as if he had not already said it aloud to the valley. He stepped back and awaited the king's judgment. Orin rose as though the movement of his body was something that reshaped the air. His voice was a low thing. "You will be kept in the eastern wing. You will serve as needed. You will not leave the keep without my permission. Is that understood?" "Yes, my lord," she said, the title grinding like stone in her throat. The hall breathed in relief that she had been properly submissive. That little human performance was all that was asked of her, and she had given it like acolyte to ritual. She had been brought to the eastern wing as ordered. The rooms were sparse, appointed with the minimal comforts of a person whose opinion did not matter. A thin mattress, a basin where water could be drawn, a shuttered window that kept the world at a distance. It was an exile of luxury when measured against the hollow, but it felt like a cage. For nights after her arrival, she lay awake, listening to the creak of corridors and the distant pulse of drums used for the king's summoning. She kept to herself as much as the walls would allow, attending to chores and retreating to the thin privacy of her cot. Then came the first night that changed the calculus of fear into something more complicated. A messenger arrived, breathless, bearing a simple instruction for Orin personally. A hunter's hunting had returned with a wound that bleached the color from their faces. The Alpha had been injured on the edge of his territory, they said. The wound was odd, the healers unsure. They requested the king's presence in the infirmary. Lyra had not planned to go anywhere near the infirmary. She did not belong in the places where power was repaired, and so she was startled when a hand, her keeper's, tugged her sleeve. "The king will see you," he told her in a voice that had the drag of duty. "He asked for his new servant. He asked for me." The thought traveled through her like rumor turned to song. She followed without swaggering, without hope, with only the precise motion of someone who knew how to obey. The infirmary was a breathless place of herbs and the smell of old saints. The king's attending healers came forward with faces smudged by worry. Orin lay upon a high cot, the cloth at his side showing a dark bloom that would not take the usual stitches. For a man whose legend was made of bone and command, the sight of his weakness shook the room. He looked worse close up, not ravaged as those in the border wars might be, but something fragile at his core. When he saw her standing in the doorway, his gaze snagged. It was a small thing, the way the muscles around his eyes tensed, as if the sight of a wolfless woman in his bedchamber was an anomaly he had not anticipated. "They said you could not shift," he said, not a question. She inclined her head. "They did." A strange smile ghosted over his face, not cruel, but distracted. "If you do not shift, then what are you good for?" She swallowed, the words sticking like nettles. "I listen. I tend. I tell stories. I make people sleep again." "You make them sleep," he repeated, as if assessing the sound of truth. He turned his head slightly so that she could see the place on his ribs where the skin had puckered in unnatural ways. "This will not take to the healer's hands. They say it is not of needle or stone. It acts like a poison that eats at the moon's pull." Lyra had heard of such things. There were curses told in hushed kitchens that might take the spark from the strongest shifter and leave a man hollow. The Queen of the East had once been poisoned in such a way, they said, and it had taken half her court before a secret healer came to her aid. The memory of those stories made Lyra's palms damp. "May I touch it?" she asked. The king's eyes held hers a long moment, a silent weighing of dignity and need. He frowned as if the idea of being touched by a woman deemed useless was intolerable. Yet the pained hitch in his breath spoke of calculation. Finally he nodded. "Do as you will." She stepped forward, hands sure despite the tremor that ran beneath her skin. The healers backed away, as if space might prevent contagion. Lyra's fingers were cool and calloused. They had worked with cloth, with heat, with the raw honesty of life. She laid them upon his side just outside the dark bloom. The skin prickled beneath her touch, like linen warming. Then she pressed gently, not as a surgeon, but as someone whose power lived in attention. There was a small sound from Orin then, a sound she'd heard in the hollow when a child finally fell asleep, the letting go of tension. Breath shuddered into evenness. The color in his face did not return, at least not in a way the healers would boast of, but the expression on his features eased. The room, held taut since she had entered, exhaled. Orin sat up with the effort that made his body a sculpture of strain, and for a moment he looked like a man who had been pulled from water by his own will. "You are not wholly useless," he said, a sentence that sounded suspiciously like praise. The healers in the corner observed with the kind of suspicion that often followed a woman who bucked a category. "You are not trained to do what she did," the head healer said carefully. "If we had known, my king, we would have—" "You did not," Orin cut him. His voice bore the authority of someone with far less patience for excuses. "She is under my protection now. You will not cross her." That declaration burned with the authority of who nested upon the throne. Lyra felt the heat of it, an odd warmth in the place where shame so often lodged. It was not kindness. It was something harder, a staking of claim that made her skin tingle with the idea of being owned, but not simply discarded. He was not embracing her. He was setting a boundary that kept her safe, by virtue of his own absolute power. Back in the Eastern Wing, rumors grew like mold. The keep had never had such an oddity, a wolfless omega in the king's private orbit. The nobles sniffed, the servants made eyes when they thought no one looked, and the guards rearranged their watches as if the presence of an outcast might invite disaster. Lyra, for her part, kept to the tasks assigned by those in power, and learned the quiet of the keep like someone learning a new instrument. Orin's orders were precise. She served where she was needed. She did not leave without permission, and she took meals in the great hall only when summoned. There were days when she glimpsed the king's private life, a landscape of books he read with the ferocity of a man starved for knowledge, of papers pinned to the walls mapping the movements of enemies. She learned the cadence of his loneliness by watching him in the courtyard, where he walked his land like a ghost exhuming maps. He was never warm in the way of laughter, but there were moments when he was almost tender, when he studied the way a farrier worked, when he listened to the report of scouts with the kind of attention one gave to kin. It was the first late winter morning when, in the privacy of the courtyard, he spoke to her of the thing that bounded him. They were walking, the two of them, a lazy circle around a fountain whose water had frozen into a sculpture of glass. The air was sharp and made their breath plumes like prayers. "There is a thing in me," he said without preface, a confession like a stone dropped into clear water. "It began long before I took the keep. I was called to it like the howl calls moonlight. It is a wound that does not bleed in a way you understand. It eats cold into my bones." She listened, hands folded because there was no other decent way to keep the tremor from betraying the curiosity that had taken root. "Is it a curse?" she asked. He snorted, but there was no humor there. "The courts call it a blot. They say that I have the king's scar, a mark that makes me less than true alpha. The truth is that I have no bite that matches my bark. There was a night when I watched my mate die and could not stop what happened. Since then, I have been a man who hides so that his enemies will not see that he bleeds." She felt something like the valley's piled shame loosen inside her chest. He bared his weakness not as a plea for pity, but like an offering, the way a man might show the splinter in his hand so it might be removed. For a long time she wanted to ask why he had not sought help, why the healers had not reached into the places where their knowledge failed. Instead, she said, "You have asked me to be what I am. If my hands can help, I will touch." He watched her then in a way that respected the bargain. "I did not think you would be willing. Most run from the sight of an imperfect man. They are cowards." "They are frightened," she corrected. "They do not like looking at what might befall them." "And you?" "I have learned that there are other sorts of ways to heal than the ones they honor. The people of the Hollow survive by stringing stories around their losses. Things sit still if you tell them back into shape." A faint creasing at the corner of his mouth suggested that he held the phrase in consideration. "Show me," he demanded, as if curiosity and command were indistinguishable. What followed was a season of terrible proximity. Oren had reasons to keep her close, one of which was that no one else trusted the sort of comfort she provided, and the other was that closeness was control. She found herself in his chambers more often than any servant should be, reading to him by lamplight when the pain dragged at his mind, pressing cool cloths to his ribs, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders when the night bit. The keep's hierarchy bristled with each impropriety, but the king's law was thick, and they fell into line. In the bubble of that chamber, under the soft pressure of tending and being tended to, their characters unveiled themselves like cards reluctantly shown. Lyra learned that Oren's armor was not simply cruelty. His coldness had been hammered by 100 slights, betrayals of kin, of allies who preferred pretense to loyalty, a childhood of orders where a wrong look could mean exile. He had become a man who trusted only the facets of his power, and that turned his tenderness into something that needed to be earned in pieces. Oren learned that Lyra's stillness contained a strength that was not made of muscle, but of the capacity to remain when others fled. Where the court had used her as proof of the kingdom's mercy, Oren came to understand that she was unwilling to let the world teach her to hate. She spoke truth with a bluntness he had not expected. When she told him the story of how the Hollow had mended a broken cart with twine and laughter, he seemed affronted at first by the simplicity. Then, one evening, as frost tattooed the windows, he smiled at her and said, "These things you do, they are small. Yet they make the world livable." He began to test her with questions that were both intimate and clinical. "Do you feel a pull toward me?" he asked once in the dark after she'd tucked away the last of his bandages. The question landed like a net. She had felt it in passing, an internal vibration when he was near, a queasy notion in those nights when seasonal moons seemed to write letters on her skin. The valley told of mates, of the dangerous thrill when fate tethered two souls. Lyra had been taught to avoid imagining such things for herself. "No," she said, honest because fear had a way of making one clearer. "I do not feel the wild pull that others speak of." He seemed relieved, a surprise. "Good. I prefer choice." Choice they had. A fated bond was not press-ganged into existence. Despite that, an unnameable gravity accumulated between them. A series of small, private moments that wound their hearts into a tighter braid. A hand finding a bandage lost beneath fur, a shared silence at dawn when both watched the same sky, a sore joke cracked with a brittle laugh. Love, as it often does, crept in through the hallway of habit. Their banter developed into a dance of sharpness softened by respect. He would tease her about the thinness of keep bread, and she would retort about the quality of Highland wine. She learned to use titles with a tilt that mocked and honored. "My king," she would say when she irritated him. "You should try bread from the Hollow. It will change your life, or at least your temper." He would fall for it sometimes, grinning like a man who had forgotten to unbuckle his heart. "Do you mean to convert the court by way of carbohydrate?" "Everything falls given a good loaf," she said seriously. Laughter in those rooms was rare and therefore precious. It settled like dust that refused to leave. The keep's staff began to find them odd, not because their companionship was scandalous, but because everywhere Lyra moved, quietly, small things happened. A guard who had not slept in days found solace in her stories. A cook who had lost a sister in the border wars started to sing while he worked because she had given him a tune. Of course, the court's monsters did not sleep while soft things grew. In the north wing of the keep, Lord Malric watched them with the kind of jealousy that sharpened nails. He was a man born into an order where a woman's worth made or broke alliances. Malric had had designs on the king's favor for years. The arrival of a woman made of lesser reputation should have been a tool for his ambitions. Instead, Lyra's proximity to Orin became a sign of her growing importance, and an affront to Malric's sense of entitlement. He moved like all predators do, with a smile made of teeth. He was the sort of relative who carried tradition as an iron bar and used protocol like a cudgel. Where the king's commands were absolute, Malric's sly influence trickled through the court in poisons disguised as advice. He began to whisper to the nobles, spinning Lyra's face into a cloak of humiliation. "A wolfless servant in our king's chambers will be a shame if allowed to remain," he said, in soft-toned exclamations at wine. "We cannot have weakness celebrated." The tension between them unfurled when Malric presented a plan to the council, a formal challenge to the king's discretion. It was legal under their laws, perverse though it seemed, a petition for the king's choices to be judged. The valley had always had mechanisms to reflect power back upon itself. It was how communities balanced a monarch's will. Malric leaned on that with the kind of skill bred into his bones. With his voice like a rope, he asked for a trial before the pack. Orin listened, expression unmoved, then stood with that quiet of one used to making decisions that shaped the landscape. "Fine," he said. "Bring them." The day the trial assembled, the keep filled like a hive before the storm. The pack sat in ranks, the council arrayed in splintered authority. Lyra was told to stand at the center, the accused by Malric's framed terms. Her hands found each other in tight fists. They trembled, not with a heat that made speech easy, but with the kind of cold fear that rides on the spine. Malric rose then, a wolf in the clothing of law, and spoke with the cruelty of a man who had rehearsed every syllable. "My king," he said, "you have accepted Lyra, a wolfless woman, into the inner chambers of your rule. You have done so in front of our eyes, showing favor to someone the valley scorns and thus eroding our order. Is this not disgrace? Does our king rule by the whims of pity?" The pack murmured agreement. Tradition was a bell that tolled in every heart. Oren sat like a man exempt from compulsion. "Bring me the charges," he said. A bailiff stepped forward with a list as long as Lyra had been alive. Malric wanted hearings, public shaming, an example to be made. He wanted to expose weakness and punish it, because in that way his own teeth would appear longer. As the accusations piled, Lyra felt herself being turned into a subject of ridicule once more. Her history, once private and dull as dry bread, was laid out as evidence of failing. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was a small thread. "I have done nothing but what the king told me. I have tended the needs of his house. I have not sought to overturn law. I ask only to be allowed my life." Malric's reply was a blade of words. "A wolfless cannot be trusted. You are unpredictable. You are an embarrassment to our line." The hall roared at that, the sound of traditions defending themselves. It was then that Oren rose from his throne. He walked down into the center of the hall, moving as if to stand with her. He did not speak of law. He spoke of himself in a way that made the room shift. "You speak of shame," he said, in a voice that calmed the sails of her fear. "You speak of unpredictability. Lyra cannot change the law. She is under my protection. If any among you seeks to lay hands upon her in the name of custom, know that I will name you traitor." The hall gasped at the king's directness. Malric's face folded into a storm. "You will not use your will to place a mark on our council. We have long traditions to preserve." Oren's eyes burned then, and in that fire something else unfurled. He pulled from beneath his cloak a strip of cloth tied with a knot that bore a symbol she had seen sometimes in the margins of maps, an ancient sigil that denoted the king's right to bind. He stepped forward and found Lyra's hand. "You stand accused," he said, not addressing the council. "You stand as one who has been chosen by the whims of a cruel society. In my taking of you, I have made a choice that we will not be shamed into reversing. I claim you before the pack." And then he did something more. He bent, an obscene act in the eyes of those who saw it as subservience, and kissed the inside of her wrist, the place where paleness was most evident. The kiss was a public claim, a ritual that would tether her to him in the eyes of the valley. The room erupted into scandalized cries. Malric's face went pale and then red as if anger had flushed paint. Lyra felt the tangle of humiliation and a wild, raw joy that made her feel exposed and held at the same time. The king's mouth on her skin stamped her with belonging in a land where belonging had been withheld. Her heart hammered in the manner of something realizing it had new muscles. The pack's reaction was mixed, some chorusing outrage, others whisked in the shock of the king's unexpected vulnerability. That night, after the court had drained away, Oren brought her into his bedchamber and closed the door on the voices of the keep. The room smelled of cedar and the faint trace of his skin. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her, not as a sovereign regards a servant, but as a man looking at an equal he had chosen. "I will not let them make you less," he said, "but you must understand what this means. To claim you is to set you inside my orbit. There will be a price. There will be people who will whisper. There will be danger." She was dizzy with the magnitude of it. "I never asked for to be claimed," she answered, the words simple but laden. "I only wanted to be left alone." He shook his head. "No one is ever left alone if they have something the world wants to stamp. I wanted you because I saw the way you touched the place where I hurt and did not flinch. You sat with my weakness." She felt the vulnerability of being seen so clearly. If she had a choice, she might have chosen a smaller life, but that was no longer hers. She had been picked, and there would be no unpicking. Still, against the ache of her valley's past, something about being claimed felt like the salt on an otherwise tasteless loaf. The days that followed were a weave of tenderness and sword. Oren's chosenness protected her from Malric's first attempts to destroy her reputation, but he did not remove the hazard of other forces who saw her as a lever to use. Whispered accusations turned into false charges that a noblewoman had been insulted, then into threats that someone would arrange a mating with another male to humiliate her. Malric was thorough and ungracious, and his venom began to harden into action. In a cold dawn made unbearable by rain, an assassin made a brazen attempt on Lyra's life. It happened in the labyrinth of corridors. A knife flashed from the shadow. She felt the press of steel and the force of hands that, somewhere outside her skin, had learned to catch and to fight. Oren appeared like a storm at the window. The blade skittered across the floor, the assassin's breath a thin ribbon as he lay with a broken wrist. Oren's own secret unraveled in that instant. The attacker had been someone from Malric's camp, a hired hand with the kind of skill that suggested direction. The king bore a mark then under his sleeve, a subtle runic thing that glowed pale blue for an instant when he struck the assailant. The light was like a thing one might see on a healing herb when it warmed to the sun. For few seconds his face went slack and something small. The wound he had hidden for so long bled open under the pressure of fury. He swallowed the pain and cradled the newcomer with a carefulness that spoke of deep guilt. The attack forced a revelation that had been both brewing and forbidden. Oren's vulnerability was not merely metaphorical. His disease, his inability to be whole in the way the pack expected, was something that could be aggravated by proximity to certain magics or slights. The runes had appeared because the king's body reacted when threatened in ways the healers hardly understood. He had the capacity to manifest an energy that could become dangerous if provoked, and the court had been ignorant of it for too long. The show of glowing light in front of the pack made murmurs escalate into fear. It was Lyra who stepped forward without thinking, fingers finding the king's pulse as if she had been born to that motion. Her hands were steady where hands might have trembled. She pressed a finger lightly to the glowing skin and told the king what she saw, that it was like a poison taking hold of breath, a thing that needed to be coaxed rather than cut. The healers were offended by her audacity. Malric declared that nothing could be left to such folly. Oren, however, leaned into her confidence as if it were a rope. "You do not know what this will cost you," Malric warned in a whisper meant for Oren's ears as much as hers. "You make her your honored companion and we will consider it a breach. There are those who will not abide." Oren's reply was a growl that rolled like distant thunder. "Then let them try." There was a moment, raw and honest, when they were alone in the king's bedchamber after the attack. The candlelight caught Lyra's cheekbones and made her look frail and luminous. Oren touched her face with a practiced gentleness. You could leave, he said softly. I could arrange passage to the hollow. You do not owe me life. She looked at his hand on her skin and found that she could not imagine going back. The valley's scorn had left its fingerprints on her spirit, but those marks had become a motivating map rather than a prison. I do not want to go back, she admitted. The words unspooled of their own accord, honest and humiliating. There was nowhere for me there. Here, at least, I can be more than a shadow. Oren's expression folded into something that might have been affection. Then choose to stand, he said, but know that choosing me is to wear my enemies as your burdens. Her choice did not end the war. It began a new front. Malric escalated after the assassination attempt failed. He planted rumors that Lyra had bewitched the king, that she had used charms to make him follow her. He rode to absent nobles with forged letters alleging that Lyra used his weakness to rule. To add insult to violence, he pressed the kingdom's laws to demand a formal pairing of Oren to a chosen mate from a powerful allied family. The alliance would seal the king's political power and force Lyra to the margins. Faced with the ultimatum, Oren made the most dangerous choice. He stood before the assembled families and refused to bow to the arranged marriage. I will not be chosen for the sake of appeasing the warm, he said. I will choose my partner. That pronouncement was a political eclipse. Lords fumed. Malric sought to marshal opposition into legal movement. The council called for trials and questioned the king's fitness to rule. The pack's voice became a chorus of worried loyalty and thinly veiled hate. In the hollow of those days, Lyra's small power, tending, storytelling, patience, became a fulcrum around which bodies revolved. Her skill was tested as political attacks sharpened into open violence. Malric dared to lay a hand on her during a council theater to provoke the king. He struck at her pride, and then, when the king did not immediately crush him, Malric brought forward real force. He allied with outlying nobles, some of whom had the nerve to ride men into the keep's outer walls. They planned insurgency with sabers and cold resolve. The keep shuddered when the rebels attacked under the cover of a storm that made night illegal. They came with siege engines and with the kind of hatred that believes it owns the universe. Rings of betrayal unfolded as those in the inner circle weighed where to throw their support. Lyra, in the center of her unchosen fate, found that she could not simply wait for others to craft salvation. The final confrontation happened in a courtyard soaked in rain and iron and the scent of burned wood. Malric rode at the head of a small cohort that believed the king's weakness would be the wedge to break the keep's rule. Oren's forces met them with the weight of loyalers who had taken his word and found it worth fighting for. The first clash was loud and primal, the bellows of men and the grinding of armor like stomachs fighting. Lyra found herself in the middle of it by accident at first. An arrow misfired, a courier fell at her feet calling out for healing. The melee was a storm in which anything might be lost. She stumbled into the line of battle with only a satchel of herbs and the stubbornness of someone not willing to look away. There was a man with a broken leg who begged for something to stem the bleeding. She worked with bandages, with telling a tale to drag a mind away from the pain. Her voice was a rope that kept people from falling into terror. The soldiers who had known only metal and orders listened like children learning a lullaby. They gathered, a human circle around her as she moved with small, steady hands. From the edge of the fight, Oren fought with the strange precision of someone who had been both animal and monarch. His sword sang, but so did his decisions. He blocked several blows and took a wound cleanly across the shoulder. For reasons Lyra could not explain, he paused then, one foot planted in a stance that split breath between things. In that slice of time, Malric moved forward and tried to strike him with a blade that would have ended him. but for the king's shield. The blow was deflected in a dance of steel that made the air rain sparks. Malric's eyes bored into Orin then, and in them Lyra read his hatred as plainly as if it had been spelled. Malric raised his blade and hollered a command in a way that no noise should have been wielded. He moved to strike at the king, and as he did, a shadow smaller than rumor and bigger than hope leapt forward. Lyra felt a voice in her head that was not hers. It pulsed like the echoes of the hollow, a memory of stories told around fire that preserved the small and the stubborn. She found, without thinking, that her hands moved, and the little satchel of herbs became a sling. She wrapped as quickly as she could a bird of feathered cloth and hurled it, a messy arc that sent a stinging mix of herbs and ash into Malric's face. He reeled, blinded and cursing, and that moment was enough for Orin to parry and then rend his advantage. The rebel's horse bolted, Malric's command faltered, and in the jagged gap, the king's forces surged and the rebel lines dissolved. In the aftermath, the keep's wounded lay in rows like a shame of the body. Lyra walked among them as if she knew a route no one else did. Her hands, which others had called useless, became instruments that calmed panic. She wrapped legs, whispered stories, offered pulp of herb to close the living gap between life and death. The king watched her from a distance, a regard that had become the sort of affection no one had taught him to show easily. After the battle was done, there was a reckoning. Malric was bound and brought to the hall, his face a map of fury. The council demanded justice. Malric claimed he had fought for tradition. Orin, with a look that made even his usual severity seem small in comparison, took up the ancient code and pronounced sentence. He declared that Malric would be exiled, not to death, but to the kind of life that would keep him out of the keep's politics forever. It was both mercy and a punishment that tasted like iron. As the court disbanded that night, the weight of what had happened settled into something like peace. The king's wounds were tended with the same exactness with which a general might count troop losses. Lyra worked late into the evening, her hands in motion as if motion itself was a prayer. When finally they were alone, Orin's voice came like a tide. "You risked much," he said. "You could have been killed." "You could have been dead," she answered, because honesty had become their mode. He met her eyes then, and for the first time he spoke not as a ruler, but as a man with something to confess. "There is more of the truth. My weakness is not simply a mark. It is a damnation of sorts. The night I lost my mate, I also took on a thing. A signed blood oath from the one who betrayed us. I kept it, thinking I could bind what I had lost. I paid for power with a sliver of myself. Since then, every time I let someone close, there is a chance the wound will open and the damnation will bleed into them." Her heart clogged in her throat like a stone. "You sacrificed yourself for an oath?" "I made a bargain," he said quietly. "I thought I could be king without a mate, without trust. It has cost me. I keep it hidden so my people will not grow fearful." "And you brought me into that," she said. "You claimed me, knowing the risk." He looked away, the gap of shame appearing in his face like a bruise. "Because you sat in my weakness without flinching. Because I wanted someone near who would not run." Her hands, the ones they had learned to watch and to trust, found the place at his ribs where the wound had first flared. She pressed without the hoopla of ceremony, her touch a quiet incantation of the hollow's small magic. The wound was cold and hungry, like a mouth with no teeth. Lyra closed her eyes and told a story, a long thing that wrapped around pain and transformed it. She spoke of a valley that mended fences through song, of old women who stitched clothes with the names of the lost, of wolves that learned to howl to songs of forgiveness rather than revenge. The words settled into the king's skin like soft cloth into a splintered box. When she opened her eyes, the king's face had changed. It was not healing that had done it in the way that salves might, but a quieting of the way his shoulders carried the weight. The runic light dimmed to a gentle ember. He breathed with a rhythm that didn't sound like fear. They had chosen each other in a way that made both of them vulnerable. The final trial for them both had come not from one opponent, but from the challenge of deciding to love in the face of ruin. The king had been challenged by Manric and the council. Lyra had been tested by the keep's venom. Their union cracked open the walls of the old order and allowed something else to slip through. A tentative acceptance that weakness might be a kind of courage if it was shared rather than hidden. In the months that followed, change crept through the keep like water finding a fault in rock. The king's decrees bent subtly toward mercy. Nomads were given plots of land. Those who had been shamed for infertility found new roles of honor, and the healers expanded their knowledge to include ways of treating the runic mark the king bore. Lyra worked at the heart of that change. She taught what she knew to those who would listen, which turned out to be many. Men and women came with ailments, with hanged hopes, with children that would not sleep. She tended them and taught them the hollow way, that the telling of a story could be as therapeutic as the application of a salve. Malric's exile turned into a cautionary tale. He fled with a hatred that stained the edges of his old friendships, and his name became something parents used to frighten disobedient children. The more vicious nobles either accommodated the new way or left for more comfortably traditional courts. The keep, over time, became a place where small mercies were not shameful but practical. It was not utopia. Power had not been dissolved, but the edges had softened. Yet the deepest work happened inside the king's bedchamber, where tenderness accrued like a slow harvest. Orin learned to let someone close enough to see blood, and Lyra learned that the mind's scars could be treated not only by stories, but by being allowed to share the burden with someone else. They argued and laughed and slept in the same sheets, as if the violence and the softness could coexist. The king's secret vulnerability, the runic wound and the legacy of his lost mate, became less of a curse and more of a truth they worked around together. It was during a summer of peace that the risk they had always feared, the binding of a mate by fate, finally made its presence known. They were in the orchard behind the keep, the sun like honey over the trees. Lyra was collecting apples. Orin watched as if astonished by the normalcy. She tossed him a fruit and it landed in his palm with the cartoon clink of two lives learning to be synchronized. He reached across and brushed her wrist, an innocent touch, and then the world shifted like the turning of a tide. The knot in her chest unfurled with a force that was not mere affection. She felt the old stories pull, the mate pull they had been taught to fear and to dream of in equal measure. It was a terrifying, exquisite thing, a thunder that pushed at her bones. Orin's face changed in ways that left rawness in the chest. His pupils dilated, his breath found a new rhythm, and the runic light at his side shimmered in response. He reached for her as if the world had become compressed into the space between their fingers. For a long, flawless second, neither of them moved. The valley was a distant idea then. The people who had made them into roles were far away on the map. In the orchard, with sunlight and the sweet smell of ripening fruit, they understood the depth of what had been planted between them. "I did not think the stars would do this to us," Orin said quietly. She found that she could only laugh, a short bark of disbelief. "The stars have a sense of humor." Orin's hand found the back of her neck, and he kissed her, as if to write the claim into a language deeper than ceremony. The moment settled like something valuable turned thoroughly familiar. It was the claiming of souls and not only titles. It was the weaving of two lives into a shared fate. For Lyra, it was the radical inversion of everything the Hollow had taught her. The outcast had become the central figure in the king's life, and that centrism had ripples. Their mating shifted more than intimacy. It altered the political arithmetic of the keep, because where the king stood, the people would follow. It transformed Lyra from an outcast to someone whose voice carried weight. She used that voice not for revenge but for a steady kind of reform. In meetings, she argued for policies that recognized the worth of those traditionally suppressed. She sat in on councils and told stories that illustrated policy, and those stories had the effect of grounding cold charts in the reality of people's lives. Her influence was small and stubborn. The final knot in their journey came not from internal politics, but from forces outside the keep, who had been stirred by the king's earlier wars. There were raids from border lords who tested whether the change in the keep had weakened its hand. The conflict that followed was rawer than any previous skirmish, because it targeted the keep's new ways, the slow social changes rather than its fortifications. It was a test of their shared life. On the field where the final battle raged, Lyra again found herself in the middle of it, but not as a passive piece. The army moved like a living thing, and she moved with them, using her storytelling to teach rallying calls that steadied nerves and bandages wrapped with hands that no one had expected to see on a standard bearer. Orin fought at the center, a fulcrum whose pain and prowess were visible to all. The enemy charged with the intention of severing the heart. They thought that tearing out the king would cleave the head and scatter the rest. But Lyra had grown into more than a healer. She had become a leader. She organized the messengers, marshaled the reserves, and stitched up a defense that repositioned lines with the ease of someone reordering furniture. The battle was gruesome and glorious. By the end, the keep had survived, though it bled. When the dust settled, they had won not only their lives but the legitimacy of their reforms. People took note of how a kingdom fought to protect its weakest, and how a leader could hold a wound and still command with justice. The enemy retreated and the news spread, not like gossip, but like a new law inscribed into the valley's consciousness. There was still a lot to be milked from the months after battle. Repairs, funerals, the stubborn persistence of the court's more conservative elements, who would never fully accept change. But under the slow light of months, the keep grew better. Orin's runic wound faded as they worked together to understand the bargain he had signed. Some nights, the light at his side would flare, and he would retreat into a silence where he needed her. She would sit with him, telling stories until the flare diminished. Sometimes a child from the lower villages would run into the chamber with a scraped knee and a laugh, and the king's hands would mirror hers as he wrapped the cloth. The sight of that tenderness did more to change hearts than the force of any edict. It was clear that their union had shifted the tide for the valley. Where once the law insisted on the physical mark of strength and the production of heirs, the keep now honored other forms of contribution, the ability to mend, to teach, to hold. Children who had been told that only muscle and wolf blood mattered began to see other kinds of worth. They visited the eastern wing and learned the Hollow's songs. The valley's old belief began to erode like ice in spring. 1 year later, things bore the imprint of domesticity that was hard-won and deep. The keep smelled less like iron and more like bread. Lyra and Orin had become as comfortable in each other's presence as people who had survived storms together. On a morning when the apple trees were heavy and the sun was a thin, patient hand, Lyra stood in the courtyard watching children play. Some were the king's, some hers, many of them the children's, whose mothers had been named in new ways to the village rather than left in shame. She had grown into a role she had not asked for, but had learned to steward carefully. The mark of being a queen, a title she accepted hesitantly, but which people gave with an ease that made her dizzy, was not a crown, but a set of small responsibilities. She convened councils with an ease she had not known, heard complaints with a patience that was a kind of power, and organized philanthropy toward those whose lives had been bruised by old rules. Their bond had produced another tangible sign of change. There was a child in the keep now, with Oren's steady jaw and Lyra's luminous eyes. The announcement of the child had been met with a mix of astonishment and celebration. The valley had not expected the outcast to mother the king's heir. The sight of the little one toddling between the throne's shadow and the hearth was revolution disguised as family. The phase of the valley, a term people used for those who still believed magic was a part of the world, claimed the child for a blessing, saying that the union of their parents had turned something like dusk into dawn. Lyra laughed at such things, but not unkindly. The child, whose hair separated in a zigzag as if born with lightning on its brow, brought out a maternal fierceness in her that had nothing to do with public law. Governance changed too. Where once the king made decrees with the unilateral force of an absolute hand, now councils were convened with more voices, and Lyra's seat at the table was not ceremonial. She argued for education and for equal treatment of those the valley had relegated to the margins. Old widows were given land, wolfless people were practiced in roles that their gifts suited: teaching, medicine, stewardship. The keep's laws softened where they needed to, but hardened against true cruelty, with punishments that targeted abuse rather than the random cruelty of old superstitions. There were critics, of course. A small faction continued to snipe at the edges, insisting that the fabric of tradition be kept intact. Lyra and Oren weathered them with a steady hand. Lyra found herself in the public eye more often than she ever had been. Where once glances avoided her, now people searched for her approval with respectful curiosity. Children who had once been taught to clutch their father's hands away from the outcast now wanted her to tell them stories. She told them, sometimes with a blunt edge, and sometimes with the kindness of a woman who had known shame and turned it into something useful. The year's end ushered in a small celebration on the keep's main courtyard. Banners flew, a market made of colors and the thrum of people's proudness wove through the air. Lyra and Oren stood together in the place where the pair had first been challenged. He wore a tunic unstiff with high courtliness, she a dress that was plain but made luminous by the way the sun caught the thread she had woven for herself. They had learned to be a unit that predicted better than their parts alone. Children climbed the legs of strangers who laughed and shouted as if the old terrors had become toys for an afternoon. The court's nobles were present not because they had given in, but because they had recognized the political reality that had changed the valley. A few scowled, and Lyra could not help but give them a look that held no malice, only an unblinking knowledge. Oren took her hand in front of the crowd and spoke. "We are not the same as we were," he said. His voice carried, but it was not bluster. "Change is a slow thing. It will make mistakes. It will be clumsy. But what is important is that we move forward with our eyes open." Lyra tightened her grip on his hand and added, "I came here a woman with no place. I stay because I have found a purpose. Not every purpose requires the body of a great hunter. Some require the voice that will not let people forget what it means to be kind." There were whoops and a rush of small applause. The Hollow's women traded glances of approval, as if they had somehow taught the valley a new song. The king's first year had become a map of lessons. In the quiet that followed, as the crowd thinned and people drifted toward hearths and lovers, Lyra and Oren walked to the orchard where the mate pole had first surprised them. Their child played nearby, a desperately grave little creature in a small gambeson that made it look as if the kingdom's future were a child with armor. They stood together under the apple trees and watched the sky take on the pale purple of dusk. The year that had passed had altered them as much as any sword or treaty. Lyra thought of the hollow and its thin comforts. She thought of the valley and the court, and how shame had been their first currency. Now she had been made into something that carried weight, and she used that weight to change the world. Oren's hand found hers. "We have done something," he said, not as boast, but as quiet record. They had. The kingdom had learned to let the weak be seen, not as a lever for cruelty, but as a fulcrum for compassion. He had learned to accept being injured by the past and to trust another's hands to help him bear it. She had risen from outcast to a partner in the keep's rulership. The pack laws had softened, but not vanished. New traditions had sprung up. Children played where once they might have been schooled in fear. They kissed under the orchard's shadow, and in that kiss were sealed the last of a year's promise. The child toddled to them with the reckless courage of youth, and Lyra laughed and scooped the little one into her arms. There were small bureaucratic things to attend, treaties to sign, harvests to plan, and the continuing task of rebuilding trust among wary nobles. But the shape of their years had shifted away from fear and toward the ordinary miracle of tending. Lyra, the girl once consigned to the margins, now walked the keep's corridors as a woman whose tenderness saved more than a few lives. Oren, the king who had hidden a wound inside his sleeve, now carried a public tenderness that others learned from. And in a small private room where soft light fell through uncurtained windows, they both slept. The king, scarred and sovereign, and the queen, tender and relentless. The keep that had been shaken by power and prejudice lay quiet in the night. Children dreamed in rooms once reserved for shame. The valley's old dogmas lay folded like old linens. A year later, the change was visible as a new kind of map across the kingdom. The beat of a different drum had started in the hearts of men and women, one that celebrated the usefulness of hands that healed and mouths that told truth. The tradition of measuring worth by a single standard began to crack, like thin ice under the weight of a new, more patient world. Lyra walked in the courtyard one morning, the child trailing after her like a small comet. She looked up at the sky and thought of the hollow. She thought of the stitched bread she had learned to bake and the stories that had taught children to sleep. She thought of the king whose vulnerability had undone him and then remade him. She thought of the pack and the valley and the way small mercies had become law. She had been an omega, an outcast, a woman who had been given over like an offering. In the city's memories, there were those who still whispered of scandal, but the story that lived now was different. It was a narrative of two damaged people who had decided that the other's faults were not reasons to flee, but reasons to hold. The child laughed and hit her hand with a wooden spoon, a sound like a small bell. At the keep's edge, where the path dipped down into the valley, a new school had been built. At its front, a plaque noted that the king's court believed in learning for all regardless of blood. Mothers who once had been hidden by custom brought their children there. Men who had been told to bury their emotions were taught to speak of them like a practice. Lyra had lectured at the opening and then returned to the Hollow's kitchen to teach bread making to anyone with the courage to show up. Oren watched her as she spoke to a circle of young mothers. He stood in the doorway with the child's small hand tucked into his sleeve. He had learned to apologize for his past with such sincerity that the confession had become its own grammar lesson for the court. To say you were sorry was to reveal humility, and humility invited trust. In the slow, golden sweep of years to come, the keep continued to stand as modest proof that monsters were made, not born, and that gentleness could be a weapon as sharp as any blade. The valley's songs were changed to include the name of a woman from the hollow who had taught a king how to make the world softer without being weaker. The children of the school chanted her name like a benediction. When the sun made its last climb one late afternoon, Lyra sat with her child on her lap and watched the valley as it had been and had become. The patchwork of fields and gardens had been reordered by a law that favored repair and learning and honest leadership. It was a world where the once shamed had new roles and where the old marks were not the entire story. The memory of being sold, of standing in a great hall as a symbol, dated to a different self. She had been taken to a king who could have left her on a shelf labeled useful no longer. Instead, he had claimed her, learned from her strength, and allowed her to become central to the keep's life. She had been the outcast who did not break under exposure but used her exposure as material to weave new communities. Oren, who had once thought of love as a risk that would undo him, now held her hand and traced the scar along his ribs with a gentleness she had taught him to accept. "We have been given a strange life," he murmured. She leaned against him, feeling the steady pulse that had once been a symbol of all she had lost. "It is ours," she said, and the word was not small. The keep hummed with simple goodness. The child melted into sleep in her arms, smelling of apples and wood smoke. Lyra and Oren stood and walked back toward the hall together, a pair whose history had been forged in fear and gentleness in equal measure. The valley watched them and, for the most part, learned to trust them. When the moon rose, thin and patient as a promise, it threw its light onto the keep's stones. Lyra and Oren stood in a doorway, hands entwined, watching the silver wash the world. The future would not be easy. There would be politics and illnesses and the small griefs that no law could chase away. But they had the tools to face them together. A king's authority that had learned to hold softness, and an outcast's skill to stitch the raw into the usable. They had become a story the valley told around its fires, a tale of scandal turned into salvation. The child in the cradle would learn the tales and perhaps, one day, teach them. For now, the keep slept with the comfort of new habits. The pack had a new rhythm. The world outside the valley would not be the same, or maybe it would. But the keep's light would shine differently now, an honest light, warmed by the exigencies of mercy. She closed her eyes and let the night press in like the kind of darkness that contains stars. In place of shame, there was purpose. In place of fear, there was a map. The valley whispered of bread and lullabies, and a king who would not hide when he hurt. And in that hush, they belonged to one another, fiercely and undeniably.